Hello friends, and welcome back to this course titled as British Poetry. Friends, we were discussing a very important text, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and we have to emphasize specifically on invocation to Book 1st and Book 9. Today's lecture will be devoted on the topic Milton caught between the Commonwealth and Monarchy. So, the topic is going to be little political, the ideology of Milton, the time of Milton, the historical context of Milton. So, what are you going to learn from this lecture? Let us emphasize on that. After the completion of this 30 minutes lecture, you would be able to discuss John Milton's life, political leanings, poetic epic grandeur, and religious individualism during English Renaissance. So, there are various things which you are going to learn through this lecture. What will be the ideology of John Milton? What are his political leanings? What does this concept religious individualism, which Milton has to portray into the English Renaissance period, and what are, let's say, his concerns of that age? So, without wasting any more time, let us focus now on the topic which we are going to study today, Milton caught between Commonwealth and Monarchy. In attempting to situate Paradise Lost in its political context, we face a particular critical choice which rests upon the kind of context which we have in mind. Friends, when we talk about, let's say, critical analysis of this book Paradise Lost, we find somewhere that it is, let's say, related to the political context of the age. The critical choice allows us to do that, and how, let's say, these things are connected in the context of the age of Milton. That is something very interesting to locate. On one hand, we can examine the stylistic and argumentative similarities between sections of Paradise Lost and Milton's more explicitly political writings. Friends, Paradise Lost is not a book which is away from all other works of John Milton. Rather, there is a connection between all of his other books, whether it is At Perdica or, let's say, Paradise Regained or the Sonnets of Milton or any other, let's say, book. On the other hand, Paradise Lost can be read as a political allegory, which is to say that events and characters in Paradise Lost can be aligned with aspects of political context of poem's creation. Friends, this book Paradise Lost cannot be considered as completely religious or Christian. Rather, the book has political allegory in it. The political concepts are hidden, but they are somewhere in the mind of Milton when he writes this book. Saturn's speech provides a strongest example of the distinctively political voice appearing in the poem. Friends, when we read Book 1, we see that there is a long speech of Saturn which is given there, in many other books also, but there is that kind of, let's say, strong and distinctive political voice, the voice of a rebel, the voice of a person with strong willpower, strong intention to work hard, to, let's say, rebel against the God, is an act which nobody can think of, but Saturn has those guts into his personality which are visible into his speech. When he addresses the fallen angels, Milton draws on rhetorical techniques which are well established in his political prose. Friends, when we read, let's say, the address of Saturn, it's a very different kind of, let's say, portrayal. It's something going deep into the personality of Saturn and indirectly in Milton's personality as well. The rhetorical techniques which Milton has used, they establish this book Paradise Lost as a political prose. Let us read a quote from Book 1, page number 242 to 245 to understand this kind of political, let's say, ideology or allegory in this book. And I quote, "Is this the region, this the soil, the clime, that we must change for heaven this mournful gloom for that celestial light. So Saturn is not a person who is, let's say, sad in hell. When he is fallen in hell, he wants to convert this hell to heaven. So he is so, let's say, ambitious person. He is so, let's say, strong in his willpower that he is not considering hell as a bad place to rule. Here Saturn uses the series of rhetorical questions with progressively more contracted syntax in order to assert his point. So we see in the Saturn's speech that he is using lot of rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are those which do not need any answer, but they are used to convince the audience, and Saturn in his speech has well, let's say, connected himself with all fallen angels who are demotivated at that point. But Milton's rhetorical sophistication also allows him to weave subtle flaws into Saturn's arguments, expressing his corrupted nature at a particularly detailed level. When we talk about, let's say, the rhetorical sophistication with which Milton has created the speech of Saturn, we can understand that the flaws in the arguments of Saturn, expressing his corrupt nature at a particular or detailed description which are visible in the book. When in book 9, which is again prescribed in our syllabus, when in book 9 Saturn persuades Eve to eat the fruit, Milton strikes a fascinating balance between making Saturn convincing and making sure his arguments are misleading. So friends, when Saturn, let's say, had an argument with Eve, how beautifully he tries to, let's say, tempt Eve, how, let's say, ably he is able to, let's say, mislead Eve or, let's say, brainwash Eve. Let us talk about that discussion in the next point. We had here, and I quote line 656 from book 9. Let us take it as an example of the rhetorical, let's say, excellence of John Milton through Saturn. And he says, "Indeed, hath God then said that of the fruit of all these garden trees ye shall not eat, yet lords declared of all in earth or air." Saturn says that whatever, let's say, is available in paradise and whatever fruits are grown in this, let's say, paradise, Eve and Adam are allowed to eat them, and they are grown here with the order of God, with the instruction of God. So whatever happens in the earth or in the air, that happens with the will of God, with the order of God. You can understand that Saturn is trying to convince Eve to eat this fruit of knowledge. Saturn deliberately misleads Eve in order to make God's restriction appear more authoritarian and perverse. So here we can see that Saturn is trying to create a very different kind of authority over God. In this scene we can see that it's Saturn who is dominating Eve's mind, but not God. But more than this, he implies that there is a contradiction between Adam and Eve, having been created as lords over the world, and they are being restricted from eating the sacred fruit. We can see from this example that there is a contradiction between Adam and Eve, which is created as, let's say, lords with the existence of Saturn in the with Eve. The implication is gentle and avoids direct criticism of God, instead putting pressure on Eve to justify God's prohibition. We can see that here in this scene Saturn is supreme and God is inferior, and this, let's say, kind of direct criticism of God is visible in the speech of Saturn, where he is trying to justify God's prohibition to Eve's mind. These examples also demonstrate Saturn's ability to modulate between different kinds of rhetorical questions. Much as Milton's prose works combine both blistering interrogation and the barbed fox knave attitude which Saturn adopts towards Eve. Friends, we can see from the attitude of Saturn that he can interrogate someone, he can bribe someone, he can befool someone, and he is the one who can, let's say, create a dominance or a possession over the body of any human being. But the stylistic similarities between Passages of Paradise Lost and Milton's poetical works are not mere chance. So, we can say that there are some similarities between Passages of Paradise Lost and Milton's poetical works. This is not a chance. We cannot say that the work Paradise Lost is completely different from the other works of John Milton. It's not the case. The ideology of Milton is same, the person is same, but his way, his rhetorical, let's say, excellence makes this book as different from all other works of John Milton. They arise in part because the characters in Paradise Lost find themselves in situations which genuinely are political. We can, let's say, see from this book Paradise Lost, friends, that the book is in itself political. The characters are political. The Milton's ideology is political. In directing the sons to create earth, God the Father is conducting an act of rulership which is inescapably political. Friends, when we look at the personality of God in this book Paradise Lost, we see that God has that supremacy and dominance into his personality. The Son of God, Christ, has to follow everything according to the instructions of God. Likewise, Saturn's attempts to rouse the fallen angels in book 1 really are reminiscent of Milton's desire to rally support for the Cromwellian government. So we can see another, let's say, political aspect in the ideas of Milton, where Saturn is trying to motivate all the angels against God, and he is trying to assemble all of them in support of him. So that can be taken as an speech for the people who are against Cromwell. Milton want to, let's say, give a message to all those people or those rebels. These broader political parallels lead us towards a more allegorical interpretation of the poem as a whole. We can begin to see how the great debate in book 2 might be read as a political satire, mocking the tiresome debate which Milton conducted in his youth. Friends, Milton was a person who kept on conducting debates with the other people. The similar kind of debates are visible in the bout of various, let's say, angels, or let's say various rebel angels in this story Paradise Lost. Similarly, the interaction of Adam and Eve is a fascinating study of gender politics, whilst the relationship between God the Father and God the Son presents an obvious ideal of kingship and the delegation of power. Friends, when we look at the speech of Adam and Eve in the poem, we see that there is a kind of hierarchy which is followed in the rule of God, in the, let's say, in the reign of God. There is a kind of gender politics where females are considered as inferior to males, like Eve is considered as inferior to Adam. Adam was created first and Eve was created thereafter. But the danger of such reading is that they quickly lose their specificity. The figure of Saturn especially accommodates a wide variety of different allegorical interpretations. He can be seen as false leader to the fallen angels, his enforcement of his own will on the great debate in book 2, recalling Charles I's willful disregard for Parliament. We can see that there are long speeches in this poem, and these characters can be politically aligned with the contemporary political leaders of John Milton. Take for example, Charles I disregarded the Parliament, which is why he can be considered as one of the, let's say, rebel or the fallen angel into that group. On the other hand, we can also see that there are different allegorical interpretations which can be made about other characters, Raphael, Gabriel, etc. in the poem. But alternatively, he can be seen to represent something of Milton and Cromwell in their revolutionary struggles against the king. We can see, friends, that Saturn, when he goes against God, he, let's say, relates himself to Milton or Cromwell, who goes against the supreme authority of king or church. So we can see that Saturn's rebel has similarities with Milton's rebellious or Cromwell's rebellious attitude. At a slightly more general level, he can even be seen to represent the failure of any political discourse in this period and of religious culture which attempts to exist apart from divine authority and biblical revelations. So friends, we can see that the divine authority or the biblical revelations, they were, let's say, not into Milton's consideration, and which is why the political discourse which Milton is trying to create can be considered as against the religious culture of his age. The problem is that Saturn is primarily identified as a force of rebellion against God, and Paradise Lost rarely seem to require us to construe him as anything else. So friends, from this book we can understand that Saturn is someone who rebels against God, and in this way this book Paradise Lost can be anything else but a political allegory. Thus, an understanding of the politics of Paradise Lost clearly depends on an understanding of the politics of English Civil War, and particularly of Milton's position in it. So friends, we can see that when this book Paradise Lost, published in 1667, Milton wanted to clarify his point of view about civil war or whatever is happening into British, let's say, society, and which is why he wrote this book as a mouthpiece of his own ideology. The application of this knowledge to the text of Paradise Lost is perhaps most effectively conducted through an appreciation of the interplay of ideas between Milton's poetic and political writings. So we can see, we can conclude, friends, through this book Paradise Lost, that this is something which is an interplay of ideas, the poetic ideas of Milton and the political writings of Milton, and how they are related to each other. Allegorical interpretations, although interesting and to some extent the natural result of the stylistic analysis of poems' politics, must be carefully qualified. Friends, when we look at this book, when we critically analyze this book, the interpretation need to be done on the basis of the allegories which Milton is trying to create. They are interesting, and to an extent they are natural result of a stylistic analysis of the poem. When we, let's say, rhetorically analyze this poem, we find that this poem is much more political than religious. Although Paradise Lost is a very much a poem of its time, it is important to remember that its settings is metaphysical and its direct concern religious. Friends, when we talk about this poem Paradise Lost, we see that this poem is the representative of its age, the soul of its age, the soul of its time, which is why the settings of this poem can be metaphysical, beyond the real world, beyond the practical world, but it has direct concerns with the religion and the political problems of this age. And in this way, friends, we can also relate this poem with the earlier poem which we have studied. It was the Canterbury Tales. Just like there was a topic which we studied in Canterbury Tales, 3 estates. So in 3 estates we see that what are the different, let's say, groups of people or the category of people whom Chaucer want to, let's say, ironically criticize through his poem. Although the poem uses a light humor and there are implied meanings, implied, let's say, ironical criticism of those categories which are, let's say, corrupt in the society, whether it is church or king or, let's say, knight or any other category. In the same way, Paradise Lost is also a kind of allegory against the corruption which existed in the royal court and the church. So, with this note, I believe that you will now read Paradise Lost as let's say a political allegory with the political interpretations and the context in which the poem was written. The Civil War situation of Charles I, Cromwell, the Puritan age, which we call Puritan interregnum as well, the 11 years time when Cromwell ruled and Milton was very powerful, and prior to that, in the rule of Charles I, what kind of problems Milton has faced, why Milton talked about the freedom of press, what was the situation of the common people and leaders of the time. All these things were addressed step by step in this poem, Paradise Lost. I hope that you are now in line with what Milton has to say through this poem, Paradise Lost. This is not something metaphysical, but this is something real, belonging to the real world, the natural world in which Milton lived and faced various problems like Galileo, his contemporary. That is all for today. Thank you for listening.